I'd like to give a deeper introduction to today's speaker. KR, we'd like to welcome you to the Cochlear Center Seminar Series. KR is a leader in the area of disability inclusion and LGBTQ rights. She's been on the forefront of issues, blazing a trail towards inclusive design and marketing for more than 20 years. Diagnosed with a severe hearing loss at the age of 3, she's made it her life's work to be a strong advocate for disabled people. Currently, she's the head of brand accessibility at Google Brand Studio, where she drives innovation, representation, and storytelling for diverse disabled audiences, a segment that's historically been overlooked. Very relevant to today's talk, she's successfully lobbied in the past on Capitol Hill with Senator Warren's team to help pass the legislation known as the Over-the-Counter Hearing Aid Act of 2017, which was a rider on the FDA Reauthorization Act. KR is on several boards, including Deaf Kids Code, American Association of People with Disabilities, and was recently appointed by President Biden to the United States Access Board. Previously, she served on the board of the Hearing Loss Association of America and the CTA Foundation. She is a nationally awarded advocate with a strong reputation in inclusive design, brand marketing, policy, and inclusion. We couldn't take her full long list, but some of her recent awards and honors include being given the U.S. Congressional Award, named Fast Company Queer 50 2022 honoree, an Adage 2022 Leading Woman honoree, Campaign 40 Under 40, 2021 Adweek Creative 100 honoree, a 2020 AdColor Rockstar Award nominee, and one of the 2019 Top 50 Future Female Leaders by Yahoo Finance. There are many, many, many other awards on that list. KR, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Nick. It's great to be here. Really excited for this conversation.
Me too. So I'd like to start out, KR, if we can just sort of ask, going back broadly, you've been so involved in advocacy at the state level, at the federal level, in disability and accessibility, but broadly across many areas, actually. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you got involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually started in Silicon Valley at 17 years old back in like 1996, so that tells you how old I am. And I actually, entering the industry, never talked about my hearing loss because I didn't feel like I would be included or accepted because I didn't see anyone else like me. And so throughout my career, I had a moment about 10 years into my career where my hearing aids broke and I had to go to an audiologist, try to get them repaired. They couldn't be repaired, so I had to replace them. And at the time, I'm in my 20s, living in Silicon Valley, working for a startup, just trying to make ends meet and pay my rent and all of those things. And the cost of being able to replace my hearing aids at that time were honestly funds and money I didn't have. And so I basically in that moment broke down, was like, what am I going to do? And just had to figure out a way to finance it. And I actually left work in the morning and had to go back to work. And so when I went back to work, at this time, I'm the national sales director for a company called Spec Products, which is an accessories company that makes cases for iPhone and many things. And we were a very small company at that time. And I walked in and I was not okay. And I talked to my CEO and she was like, what's going on? Like, talk to me about this. And I said, well, the truth is I have hearing loss. I had to get some hearing aids I couldn't really afford. And she was like, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you talk about your hearing loss? We were supporting you and all those things. And I told her why. And so it was like my coming out moment, so to speak, around my disability. And so she said, we'll support you, we'll get you through this, and let us know what you need. And then she said something to me. She said, someday you need to go advocate for this, because it's surprising to me. She was unaware of like the lack of access and the cost and all of those things. And I'm looking at her going like, who's going to listen to me? I'm just some, young woman in Silicon Valley trying to make this company successful. And so that led me on a journey to eventually going to a company called Pebble, which was a smartwatch company. And I had a side project with Starkey where I used Pebble's Open API to create a smartwatch application that would allow me to control my Bluetooth hearing aids from my watch and not have to pull out my phone. And so that was something for me that I wanted. And this is before Apple Watch and smartwatch revolution and all of that. And I went and I told my story through the company and PR and all of that. And I got a lot of attention where I was talking about taking the medical innovation and consumer products and really bringing those worlds together and trying to help shift social acceptance around technology, especially around hearing aids. And so I became a known advocate for that. That led me to Doppler Labs, where I really started to push the world of like consumer headphones and audio technology into the and the medical like advancements that I saw could happen. And that again led to a journey of like over-the-counter hearing aid ads starting to be in conversation in 2017 that passed. And so I was really pushing to help hearing not be so stigmatized depending on like how you identified, right? So hearing loss to me is on a spectrum, and it's not about age or older adults, or it's only for, you know, a certain demographic. It was really about like, how do we help all people of all age, of all identities address their hearing loss, because it has long-term consequences when they don't. And how can we shift society to think about disability in general differently? And so that's been really my goal, and my advocacy is about changing people's perceptions about disability and overall, and really shifting representation and bringing innovation along with the movement of society and disability culture to be more inclusive, to be more seen as a part of who you are and not separate, right? And so that's really been what my advocacy has really been about, is because for me, I don't just identify as my disability. You know, I'm a woman, I'm queer, and I have a disability, and I'm those three things every day. And all those identities matter to me. So it's really about shifting perception, but also using innovation as a way to like move the movement forward, especially when it comes to hearing.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing all that. I love how your story is so, you know, it's this personal moment for you. And then a lot of your advocacy is really actually lifting up others' stories and using your skills in marketing and brand awareness and advertising to really push, you know, others. I'd actually like to key in a little bit on, you mentioned a little bit about innovation, sort of pushing awareness. But I've also heard you say in the past that representation is fundamental to innovation. Can you explain that a little bit?
Absolutely. So I'll give you an example, right? We see, especially in the industry I sit in, which is consumer products and consumer electronics. And there's a lot of innovation that happens, especially around accessibility and disability. But if people don't relate or identify with why they may need something or how that may help them or someone else they know, and they don't relate, that's where marketing is really important, right? Our job is to authentically represent a community, to help people see like the broad identity of disability and all the intersectionalities of identity that cross that. So if you're marketing a product to someone, but you're not showing the authentic representation of that community, the two won't connect, right? So innovation can't move forward because if you're only marketing to an example, I'll give you an example of hearing aids have typically always been marketing to an older white like demographic, but there's many people who can benefit from hearing technology, and you're leaving a lot of the audience out, right? And so that's where marketing and innovation come together, right? Our job is to like really show people the true identity of disability and how that touches, but not just that, the people that connect to disability, right? The family members, the caretakers, the friends, the colleagues, right? There's this circle around that person that connects them, right? And it's not usually the person that decides who has the hearing loss that picks the product. It's usually coming from influence of someone else, right? And so that's why the two are really important to go hand in hand, is is really making sure that you're authentically representing disability truly in all forms, and bringing that innovation to those communities and reaching them. And that's the power of marketing, right? But that's also our job, is to make sure that the innovation is really being, giving the stage as well, and being truly showing you all the use cases and the capabilities that can provide someone to be helpful.
I love this. I see, I'd love your thoughts on, do you see some parallels sort of in research as well? You follow everything that's coming out, right, from academia, particularly around hearing, but in general, do you see a parallel for representation in research?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really key. Is I'll give you an example. Like, let's look at, the communities and the areas of where, let's say, hearing loss is impacting. And what I saw for many years is the iPod generation, right? Is I saw these young kids walking around with earbuds in their ears at like 140 dB, blasting their music. And all of a sudden now in their 20s, they're getting ear ringing, they can't hear, they're having like cognitive issues, they can't like stay focused, and they're not understanding why, right? And I just saw like, there's this generation that's going to come up, and we need to be thinking about them. Like, research is really important to look at all demographics, but also the younger generation. Hearing loss is getting younger and younger and younger and younger, right? So that's where it's really important to keep your finger on the pulse of like, what innovation is coming? How are those going to be utilized by those communities? How do you get that adoption to happen? Especially when you look at Gen Z, for example. Gen Z is a very different audience, right? They actually really are passionate about accessibility. They demand accessibility. They see disability as not binary, right? Not like you're disabled or you're not disabled. They see it as a core part of their identity, along with other things from gender identity and so forth and so on. So that's where research is really important, is thinking about who the audience is in the long term, but being relevant, right? And really staying connected to how we can use the world we live in, which is incredibly digital now, and connect with getting that audience to like really want to adopt technology and how it's going to benefit in the long term, right? So this is where we're seeing a crossroads happening with innovation and research. And honestly, the generation now is going to completely change how adoption happens because of the way that they engage and believe in accessibility. You're not having to convince them, which used to be the case in older generations, to be honest. So that's where I'm really excited, is seeing like where AI, machine learning, and all those things are advancing, and how we're going to be able to utilize that to help people, especially hearing loss, and all the ways that hearing loss can benefit, from like cognitive to mental health to all those things that are super important. And so we're seeing this huge movement happening, not only disability representation and culture, mainstream culture, but also focus more on accessibility and innovation overall.
I love that. I see, I sort of hear you saying a lot of, technology here is sort of this key to unlocking accessibility, but I love how it's synergistic, because, accessibility and representation seem to be the key to sort of driving technology. And, to that point, I've sort of heard you talk a little bit in the OTC space, and I know, at Google, you can't talk about everything, but I'd love your thoughts on, as OTC hearing aids, come out and start to, become mainstream, and we see them more, do you see this spurring technological innovation, vertically, as well as perhaps even sort of horizontally to some extent?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I mean, that was why I really pushed, like many years, 15 years ago, was when I was seeing the headphone space, for example, and Beats was the hottest thing at the time, right? Everyone was wearing Beats around their neck. It was like a statement, right? It wasn't about the innovation. It was about like, I'm cool and I'm popular. And I kept thinking, wow, okay, if I could just get hearing technology into headphones and people would accept it because there was a brand that they thought was cool and relevant and allowed them to feel included. And so all along, I was like, how are these two worlds not coming together where you can use brand to help elevate adoption, right? Because people really connect with brands and they're loyal to them. But also, how could we advance innovation in a platform that's already there? And so you see that, right? You see how, AirPods, for example, earbuds, for example, are widely accepted, socially accepted. Everyone walks around with it in their ears, and getting that real estate was really critical in the movement, right? So now you have mass adoption. That was the hardest thing, where hearing aids were harder because they were so stigmatized. But now you already have ear real estate, right, with headphones. And now the innovation in battery technology, in occlusion, in spatial audio, all those things have helped kind of move like the way that headphones could then address potentially hearing loss and give that a platform. And so that will continue. I definitely see that growing. And also allowing, you're seeing hearing companies and like big brand names come together, right? Because they can leverage each other and really help like move this space forward. And then you have cost. That was also a big issue, right? Is now you have cost that can come down to a reasonable price point because supply and demand, right? The more supply you have, the more you can bring the cost down, which makes it more accessible. Going down into the future, what I see is more brands getting into this space, because hearing isn't just about like controlling me being able to hear better. It's about allowing people to control their experience, right? Maybe you want to turn the world down. Maybe you want to cut the crying baby out. Maybe I just want to hear your voice, Nick. Like, those are things that everyone can benefit from, right? So what I see happening is it's going to start with the obvious use case, someone with hearing loss, but it's going to grow into this like experience, situational kind of fundamental tool, but also be socially acceptable, affordable at the same time. And it's going to help destigmatize hearing loss, right? Because you and I could be wearing the same product and using it in completely different ways, and it doesn't matter. It's just like all of us have phones, or an iPhone or an Android phone. We all have apps on our phones. We have completely different apps, right? We have the same device, but we use those devices in completely different ways. And so that's where I see this evolution happening. And I really believe this is like the tip of the spear. OTC really is like, was that breakthrough point? And now it's going to create a whole new industry, right? I really believe that, because look at the number of people that have any kind of hearing issue. There's millions and millions, and that number is only growing. And so I think it'll be a really exciting time in industry, because you'll see so many advances so fast, right? As before, there was no reason to speed up innovation. Now you're in an industry where everyone's competing, right? So you're going to see innovation move incredibly fast. And I'm excited for that.
Yeah, me too. I love that. As we talk about innovation, you're kind of talking a little bit about how we're sort of seeing like OTC as a first step, right? And it's unlocking some doors. Could you expand upon that at all, on where you think that goes? You sort of see, maybe I hear a couple of themes in the way you're presenting this. One, we're moving from thinking of hearing loss as sort of a binary yes, no, to just hearing and sound. And then I'm also sort of hearing that perhaps there's more than just the traditional hearing aid, right? And an innovation standpoint. Do you mind going a little bit deeper?
Yeah, I mean, I can give a comparison. The comparison I like to look at is, let's look at closed caption, right? Closed caption originally came in, really was meant as a way for deaf and hard of hearing people to engage in content on television and phone. Look now, like many decades later, everyone is using closed caption. You're seeing it in social media. You're seeing it as a way to like people creatively are engaging in it, but people without hearing loss are using it, right? It's become a very mainstream accepted thing that's just expected, but people are also using it in creative ways. I see the hearing device industry doing the same thing, right? We had one way of doing something, one way of getting access to it. And now I see that OTC was really like, we have to get hearing into mainstream. We have to get innovation and brands to come together to show why this is something they want, but also need. And then using that way of advancing innovation to really like break open. So I see OTC as an access thing, right? It was a way to break into mainstream. And it was inevitable, right? We needed that to really address the fact that the adoption rate in hearing technology was stagnant and just wasn't moving. And so that is one way to break in and to reach more audiences in a different way. How companies will do that can come in two forms, right? It can come in the way that they innovate and the way that they position their brand as who they're marketing towards, right? So I go back to my point of like disability innovation, which is really like representation of disability, bringing accessibility and innovation together to move into a market, right? Create a whole new market. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but I see the parallels there, right? Of like what has happened in closed caption to where I see the hearing aid industry or the hearing device innovation world going to a point where it's like, I really believe 20 years from now, it'll just be a norm. It'll be like glasses. And I know a lot of people hate that comparison, but really like I see people have 5 pairs of glasses and it's a fashion statement and they don't even have any eyesight issues. Like they just like them, right? And that's where I want to see hearing technology goes. I want people just to want it, right? Because then that gives you a place to start to really help people, right? That's the goal, is we're trying to help people who truly do need this innovation to move forward. And if there's mass acceptance in society and there's less stigmatization, then innovation can move forward.
I love this. I guess while we're sort of on the stigma topic and, talking about hearing, and I really enjoy the way when you talk about hearing, you talk about hearing technologies and augmenting, and you're not focusing it on just hearing loss, right? It could be anybody. It sort of begs the question about the next shoe to sort of draw. Like, there's a lot of things that I think are going to happen after OTC, but, do you think that we need, perhaps going forward, sort of a different way of sort of talking about hearing loss in general versus hearing? Right now it's very, I have hearing loss and that's sort of it, right? It's a blanket term and it almost hides, the very, very diverse population within the hearing loss terms, or hard of hearing or deaf, right? We have these very specific terms that we sort of attribute. Do you have thoughts there as to where we might go?
Absolutely. I mean, I've always said hearing is really on a spectrum, right? It's not you're hard of hearing or you're deaf. And the deaf community has very much defined like what that means to them. But when you look at like really the hard of hearing spectrum, that's not defined. And that comes in so many different ways. So I look at it and I'll give it like the way I see it is, back in the 90s, when you look at honestly sexual orientation, you had gay and you had straight. And now you have LGBTQIA+. I see hearing as an identity marker. There'll be an evolution of like how you identify, right? And that's still going to play out over time, but it won't just be I'm hard of hearing. That means so many things. That is not clear. And I think that is what needs to evolve and will evolve in this, right? Like there will be a way that people will identify where their hearing falls on the spectrum, and there'll be like a way to identify and connect to that versus, and just like the deaf community has kind of really put an identity marker around who they are, the culture, and how they feel. This over here it's still not clear, right? And the reason for that is because people would just be in denial. They would just say, I don't have hearing loss, or like, I don't want to address that because there was nothing that said it's cool to have hearing loss, to be honest, right? So I see hearing as an identity shifting, right? I see that growing, and how that like lexicon will evolve, time will tell, right? But I really believe that's going to start happening, right? Because going back to Gen Z, for example, disability to them is a part of their overall identity, and they're pretty proud of that. So it'll be interesting to see like how the hearing identification part of who you are will evolve. And I actually have very much wanted that myself, right? Like people would ask me, what's your disability? And I say, severe hearing loss, and people like honestly don't really know what that means, but like audiologists know what that means, right? They know how many dB your loss is, and like I can tell you my audiogram chart, but that doesn't make any sense to an everyday person, right? So that has to kind of evolve in a way where it's understood, right? That kind of like the way we talk about it and how you identify it needs to evolve.
I love it. I love it. I think, it sounds like consumer technology is going to play a key role here in, it's not that, audiology is fantastic, and, it's the top of like sort of a pyramid, if you will. But, we need ways to sort of reach everybody. And so rethinking the way we talk about hearing loss, accessibility and measurement. I'd love to go a little bit back to, OTC and what kind of innovations I think we're going to see. And something you and I have talked about in the past is, to some extent, the way we think of an OTC hearing aid may already be, not outdated, but there's already an evolution happening where, we become hardware agnostic, and it's focused on the software and overlays. Could you sort of expand upon that for our audience and give us a little bit deeper insight there?
Yeah, I mean, I think even just the term OTC, I think that will change and evolve, right? But again, like the goal of OTC was addressing mild to moderate. That's a very specific segment, right? And how I see the evolution is like, what do people really want when it comes to their hearing, right? They want to control. They clearly want control over their experience, the moment they're in, being able to change their experience or adapt to their experience. And I really believe that software will take us there, right? So it's like, I give the example of like when Pebble came out as a smartwatch. It wasn't iOS only, it wasn't Android only, it was its own OS that sat on top of Android and iOS, right? So it didn't matter what operating system your phone had. Pebble's OS was able to sit on top of that, and you were able to choose your own hardware however you wanted, right? That's the thing that's important. People want choice, they want customization, they want control. And those are the things that we'll see, I believe, this is my opinion only, that I believe will happen, right? Is you'll see platform agnostic that will sit on top of multitude of hardware choices, right? It will be very much like a phone, right? And so that's where I see it going. And that's really exciting, right? Because that could benefit people in far more ways beyond hearing, right? That can go into all different areas of disability, cognitive, all those things, neurodiverse, all of those areas that are, really like getting mainstream attention. And so that's what's exciting to me, is like this OTC was like the breakthrough point, right? And now you'll see like how far can this go, right? From an innovation standpoint, from a hardware choice standpoint. And so I'm interested to see. I really believe even 5 years from now, it'll be a much, much different landscape. And right now, I think it's more about like companies trying to better understand like where the opportunity is in this space, because it's pretty new, honestly, for both sides, both the hearing aid industry and the consumer products industry. This is a new domain that honestly has never existed. So that has to kind of play out a bit, right? And so, and then you'll have like the obvious ones that will probably figure it out and break through and be like Apple to Google to Microsoft of hearing, right? Who knows what that will be? It may not even be tech. It could be somebody completely different. And so I'm excited to see that, because ultimately that's what we want. Is I just want to be able to like hear what I want to hear, how I want to hear it, and not be like frustrated, right? And not feel like limited. And I even feel like, this is me personally, Nick, is I even feel like, am I really fully experiencing everything in the world when it comes to sound or hearing, right? It's such a different experience depending on what hearing aid I wear, right? And again, the severe hearing loss like part still is limited. That also will be the next area we really have to address, right? But for now, it's like, let's see where we take mild and moderate. My hope is that we're thinking about breakthroughs in the severe hearing loss space too. And that, of course, like I highly will say this, is like, that is where you do really need medical professionals and people who understand like how that will impact you and what your choices are. But you also have to give consumers and the users choice, right? And that's important, because we want them to adopt the technology. So my hope is that someday I have a completely different experience than I have right now, and a less frustrating one, to be honest.
Yeah, I hope so too. I love the way you think about this. You know, you're talking about how OTC actually has downstream effects on a segment of the hard of hearing and deaf population who are not actually targeted by OTC. You know, so it seems to me that group, and when we're talking through this, it's technology, right? Where we're thinking like advancements on that. You know, I'd love your thoughts on what do you see down the road tech-wise, or even if you could just broadly comment on some areas. You know, is this artificial intelligence and machine learning that we need to start applying? You know, Bluetooth LE and Auracast are coming through. You know, do you have any thoughts there?
Well, I'm not an engineer, so
I
I'm
know.
not buzzwords like AI and ML. But I'll give you an example of an experience I often have. Is I'm driving in my car, someone calls me, and it immediately goes to my hearing aid and not to the car. Drives me crazy. And the car is, again, goes back to my comment of situational. How do you apply the world of hearing innovation in that situation where my wife is driving the car and she's trying to talk to me, but it's noisy and I can't hear her and she's facing forward, so I can't read her lips, right? I can't have a conversation. So how do you change that experience in the car?
Yeah.
Like, that's not something in my ear necessarily, right?
Yeah.
It's in the situation you're in. So how does innovation in cars happen when it comes to having a conversation? Like, that's where I see innovation in hearing happening. It's the situation you're in, not just what's in your ear or the person. It can be in your living room, it can be in your car, it can be in your commute, it can be in your office. How are we changing that infrastructure to allow someone to engage, like stay connected, right, in many different ways, right? And so that's where I see, like, I hope that we can see that change with, AI and also machine learning. I'm going to make a statement. I'm not an engineer. I have no idea how that works. I don't work on that stuff in Google. So I'm just going to say that is my dream. But you can see how that could make sense, right? It's like if you go back to the platform agnostic thing, whether it's sitting on a phone, in a car, in, like, you see what I mean? Like, that's where things get really interesting. Like, how do you embed this into actual infrastructure that's where we really need to go, right? Like how many of us have been in an airport and there's a gate announcement and no one can hear what that gate announcement is, and then maybe you miss your flight. That could really like futuristically imagine like everything quiet down and you hear that gate announcement. So yeah, that's where I kind of see it. But again, that's just my dream. But you never know. We could go there. I don't think that's so far-fetched.
Yeah, I love this. No, I love this. I think maybe building back off of what you were talking about earlier, the key to these AI and these machine learning algorithms is, real user input. And, maybe one of the great things about OTC, for better or for worse, is that it does directly connect that consumer to the company, and it builds off of what you were talking about before. It's foundational to have representation in technology innovation.
Right. Yeah. And the other point I will make is it is so important that we have the communities in those rooms when you're thinking about that innovation, when you're doing that research, when you're even thinking about the story you're going to tell. And often that doesn't happen. People who don't even live the experience are doing all of that, and they're not even asking questions that could completely shift your research, your innovation, your story into in a different direction, all because you're asking someone with the lived experience, right? And that's like my work at Google and doing live captioning and all those things. I'm not an engineer. I was just saying, like, this is the experience I want to have, and this is the impact it can make. And now live captioning is part of Google Meets, it's part of Workspace, it's part of, the Android phone, like it's part of like the Google ecosystem, right? And that's because everyone uses captions in some way, even right now. Not on Zoom, but I would tell people to use Google Meets. But again, like when you bring in those voices, you can completely shift your innovation roadmap, and you can completely shift the audience you actually bring into that innovation. And that's what's really important. And I want more companies to do that.
I love that. I'll remind the audience and everyone in the room, please feel free to insert questions. Happy to sort of try to work some questions in now or here at the end. KR, I want to ask, you're a big picture person, right? You've really seen the big picture here and where we're going. What do you think? Do we need more complementary legislation? Are there things that we need to sort of pair with OTC? Is there anything that we really need to be advocating on next?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like OTC is still leaving out a pretty big audience. And originally, if we go back to like the spectrum of what OTC was going to cover, it was actually supposed to go all the way to severe hearing loss, right? And there was a compromise to bring that down. There is a next level of OTC in some way, right, that needs to address the severe hearing loss spectrum, right? So we need like a phase 2. We really do. Because innovation is going to go there. It's going to go there. And consumer products are now, and consumer brands are on this ride, on this journey. So why not be 10 steps ahead and think about, okay, who's the next generation that we need, or the next audience that we need to address, and either legislation or the way that we can think about what we learned from the first round of OTC, where it's gone, and where does it need to go next in the next audience that needs help and support, right? And I include myself in that very much, because again, it's about choice, it's about access, it's about providing innovation to everyone. And we need to think about that. So for me, I hope this first phase of OTC is the tip of the spear to break through. But I want us to go back to, there's still this big audience over here that we need to help find a solution for, and wait for that to break through too. And so that's why I feel like legislation could come again, but let's take the learning of the first round and then let's apply like responsibly, like how we can see that, because clearly. It's being accepted, and it's moving an industry forward. It's moving, disability forward. And so that's what I hope comes next. I really, really hope that we do that. And it's neutral, right? From a political standpoint, disability is not red or blue. And so it helps everyone, every constituent. And that's what we saw with OTC, pretty much unanimously passed through, because no one's going to argue. Everyone has someone, they know someone that's experiencing hearing loss. Let's just state that fact. So my hope is now we can look at that again. And it'll move through a lot faster, I hope, this time. We won't be waiting 5 or 6 years, 7 years. We're actually can push the next phase forward, and that's what I'm really excited or hopeful for.
Yeah, it's like we've sort of opened some doors, and maybe it'll be faster this time. I love that. I want to, again, anyone in the audience, please feel free to chime in if you have any questions. But I do want to sort of ask you and change maybe back to what we were earlier talking about in marketing and brand awareness and accessibility. I would actually be super curious, and I know we did not talk about this question ahead of time, so maybe I'm putting you on the spot, but what are your thoughts on what are we going to see in terms of marketing campaigns around hearing, or just like brands around focusing on hearing broadly across the spectrum? I mean, do you envision a lot focusing in on deep storytelling, hearing loss? I would love your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already seen some of it, right? We're seeing brands show disability more as a part of their identity, right? And we're not calling out the disability, right? We're talking about the person in brand storytelling. I'll give a really great example of Google did a commercial back in 2021 called A Coda Story, and it talked about a Googler named Tony Lee, whose parents, he was a coder, his parents were deaf, they were immigrants from China. And during the pandemic, he and his wife had just had a new baby, they were new grandparents, they weren't able to be together because of COVID, using Google Meet, using live captioning, educating people about what CODA was, showing the technology innovation that kept them connected and staying together. And everyone, when we lost that commercial, could identify in some way, because it was ultimately about connection. It was about communication. It was about also different language being spoken, right? And so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing disability tell a story of the person and who they are, where they come from, what they're passionate about. And then how is innovation helping, right? How is innovation playing a role in their life, and how is that helping them engage and move forward in society? And that's why you're seeing such a huge disability movement in culture. You're seeing Someone Blair on Dancing with the Stars. You're seeing Lizzo change her ableist lyrics. You're seeing Coldplay go on Twitter and ask how they can make a more accessible concert experience. It's interesting, the spectrum of culture that is now attached to I want to be on this disability movement, and then elevating that using their platform, and then talking about the tools, the innovation, the needs. And so that's what's exciting, is because now we're at this amazing movement in disability culture that is also going to allow us to have multiple conversations of cognitive, neurodiversity, hearing, you name it. And it will be something that people will connect with, because we'll be able to tell it in a way that's relatable, authentic, multiple identities. When you talk about, I always say disability is touches every LGBTQ, gender, age, race, all those things. Disability touches all of it. We're the world's largest minority. So it's you're open game to talk to so many different audiences. And then when you talk about hearing, right, that will be a part of the overall innovation in storytelling we see.
I love it. I think this is so fascinating, KR. I love the way you present this as an intersectional approach to, disability representing multiple, populations. And I see exactly what you're saying. And, on this concept of innovation, again, being driven by representation, and sort of vice versa, the innovation driving accessibility.
Right,
You know,
absolutely, absolutely.
it's such a beautiful message. We are coming up on the top of the hour. I haven't seen any questions come through, but please, if anybody, again, wants to throw anything out, last chance. Otherwise, KR, I'd love, do you have any final thoughts that you wanted to share today with our audience? A lot of academics, very, very keen to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the thing that's really important for me is like this innovation needs to continue, but it comes from academia, it comes from research, that's where the innovation starts, right? And so the role that you play here is a critical part on how this innovation will move forward, but do be thinking about the who and the why. Like that's really important, not just because there's a segment of the market. Think about who you're trying to impact, why you're trying to impact them, and are those people in the room when you're thinking about your research? Are you having conversations with the communities and the communities where they're at, right? Like somebody with a disability in Silicon Valley who's white is very different than someone with a disability who's Black who lives in the South. Like those are things also to think about, right? Like the societal impact, right? When you look at the compounding layers, that's also super, super important in your ways you're thinking about your research. Really about like making sure no one is left behind. And that's really, really, really important.
I see, perhaps we have one question. So real fast, we'll try to get that in. It is 1 o'clock though, for anybody who was waiting for the top of the hour. Can you put can the question be put in the chat for me to see? Or we can take it from the room. Okay. There was a question posed, let's see. The idea you brought up of innovations in hearing bring benefits to the whole population, including those with no or perhaps subclinical hearing loss. Captioning is the example you brought up, is extremely interesting. Maybe against your disability accessibility expertise, but are you doing any with any work, or do you have any work or thoughts about how we can benefit those without hearing loss going forward?
Yeah, I think that hearing again is a spectrum, and it's not just about hearing loss. Hearing affects so many different things. It can affect autism, it can affect ADHD, it can affect so many other areas of cognitive, right? I often say, like, I just need the world to quiet down because my cognitive load is so burnt out from lip reading all day long. Like, that's the scenario where I don't want the world just to be louder so I can hear. Sometimes I need it to shut off. And so like the recovery is really just as important as the being able to hear. So don't think of like hearing as just loss. Like think of hearing as how someone takes in information, how they're processing it, how they can benefit from having control over that. That's where you really need to look at it, is like hearing is touching so many different things. And once you kind of like looked at a way that someone can have a truly different experience, don't assume, right? This is where having people in the room and really asking like all their experiences and what hearing is touching and what hearing is impacting for so many people. And it's invisible, right? A lot of people don't know what someone's going through, like what I just said. Often I need the world to shut off because I just can't handle the cognitive load anymore. And so that's important to keep in mind. Like, it's not just about loss. There's a whole spectrum.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing this. Thank you so much for being with us today. We very, very much appreciate your insights. For trainees at the Cochlear Center, you'll have a chance to talk with KR coming up here, I think actually next, right? And to all of our attendees today, thank you so much for attending. At 1:15, sorry. So we have a little 15-minute break. KR, can't thank you enough. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Nick. I really enjoyed being here, and I always appreciate the conversation with you.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Thanks, everyone.
See you soon.